Good day, dear listener. Today I wish to tell you a story from the before four times in the past histories of mankind, before the fateful meeting of humanity's greatest enemy, the Vandal. Today we shall discuss the history of the proud warrior race, the Tavarin. Humanity, under the UPE, or the Unified Planets of Earth, made first contact with another alien species in 2438, at the point of a barrel. A nav-jumper named Vernon Tar had mistaken a Banu vessel for a potential hostile. War was however reverted in spite of his mistake, and the Human-Banu Trade and Peace Accord was signed during the same year and avoided a potential conflagration. A treaty which humanity and the Banunity enjoy to this day, half a millennia later. Therefore, it is understandable that humanity going forward after this perhaps rather close call would strive to stretch out a hand first whenever they met the next cohabitant of the galaxy, but still arming the other. It would not be until nearly a century later when humanity would make first contact with another species, the Xi'an, the Zhan, or the John. Hostilities were nearly started once more when humans were discovered in a Xi'an-claimed system called Pallas, attempting to terraform Pallas 3 for their own habitation. Khif, as the Xi'an called it, was off-limits to humanity and would give rise to the so-called Pallas incident, Pallas being the human name for the same system, where war was again averted by humanity backing off out of the system to prevent hostilities. Twice, humanity had averted a catastrophe by avoiding wars with two species which humanity knew very little of. Humanity would, however, strive forth ever boldly into the stars, looking for new places to colonize and terraform. Would it be too much to ask for a third, mostly peaceful meeting? In the year 2541, humanity would make another fateful meeting within the cosmos, when humanity under more refined and peaceful means would make first contact with a new species, the aforementioned Tavarin. The Tavarin were discovered by Dr. Kellar Lench on November 15th during a survey of the Elysium system, as it was called by humanity, where he'd found the homeworld of the Tavarin species, Khif. Rightfully deciding that it was not his place to make first contact, he only sent a research drone down to the planet, which he soon lost contact with. Being faced later with a number of ships headed his way upon the loss of the drone, Dr. Lench opted to retreat swiftly to the Centauri system to avoid the diplomatic blunders of humanity's past. Upon making more official first contact with the Tavarin, humanity would be faced by a bird-like species before them, of roughly the same size and stature as a taller human, if a bit more lean. Their bodies are covered in feathers much like birds found on humanity's home planet of Earth. It could be assumed that these feathers come in all different shapes, sizes, and coloration, depending on where the particular Tavarin may originally hail from. It could also be assumed that the Tavarin have sexual dimorphism. These feathered bipeds followed a distinct mono-religion as humanity understands it, the belief in the so-called Rijora, which could be upheld in similarity to the knightly oaths of Europe, or perhaps more accurately, the Japanese Samurai Bushido Code, favoring honor, fealty, and duty to the extreme where excommunicated individuals, or individuals found to be breaking the code, would be executed. Joined together with this fervent religious code, the Tavarin were lorded over by a feudalistic oligarchy overseen by a military government headed by their highest office, the so-called warlord. In spite of the highly martial culture of the Tavarin, non-combatant civilians were also considered a resource which could be utilized by the Tavarin collective. Even with their lack of martial participation, they were still respected and maintained positions of honor within the society. Humanity had had the luck of being first in comparison to the Tavarin, having been able to expand further and faster due to the human technology of terraforming. The Tavarin, being no less ambitious than humanity, were sadly limited to pre-habitable worlds or protected colonies in order to expand. And already shortly after making first contact in 2541, the Tavarin were already covetously observing human worlds and finally came to the conclusion that their only course of action was to attack. At the start of the war, humanity possessed more worlds, more colonies, and a larger population than the Tavarin. Both species also appearing to be quite overpopulated at the time, it could be assumed that the human leadership were not entirely against a war with the, on paper, weaker Tavarin. But ultimately, it was the militaristic society of the Tavarin that decided to draw first blood with their invasion of human space. The tip of the Tavarin spear appears to have fallen upon the Idris system, which was a direct jump point connection to Elysium, the Tavarin home system. Falling under siege by the relentless Tavarin, heroes would arise from the fires of war. Even civilians would take up arms to face the invaders, with one notable individual rising above the rest: Rachel Locke. Rachel would raise her own guerrilla band to strike at the Tavarin, presumably made up by regular human forces and civilians that answered the call to defend their home. This band of guerrillas would eventually become known as the Greys, consisting of merely a few hundred to face the unnumbered hordes of the Tavarin. Even when the regular human forces were defeated and presumably retreated from the surface of Idris 4, the Greys carried on the fight. Miraculously, partly due to the actions of the Greys, the majority of the civilian population of Idris 4 had managed to escape the Tavarin onslaught. As the Tavarin were setting up a planetary defense system to defend against a possible human counterattack, Commander Locke ordered a raid on the Tanis Central Plaza, where presumably the central hub of the defense system was kept. Either led by Commander Locke herself or her second-in-command, Alana Shaw, they were met with disaster, and most of the raiding party were either killed or captured. Amongst the captured was Alana Shaw herself. The Greys, having nearly been totally defeated during the raid, watched as their comrades were executed live on broadcast by the Tavarin occupiers. The utilizations of such brutal tactics by the Tavarin was not met with the desired effect, however, with the human resolve and fervor only increasing with a desire for vengeance. Details are scant on the progress of the war after the capture of Idris 4, but the grueling campaign continued for 2 more years, with the Tavarin, in spite of their technological inferiority to humanity, managing to push the humans back as far as the Farron system, and gaining significant ground in the Centauri system. It can be assumed that a particular vessel you may have previously heard about found itself facing the Tavarin on these fronts. Being designed in the 2520s, it could be assumed that one of the mainstays of humanity's defense and offense would be the highly regarded Perseus class of gunships. The Perseus having become so popular that it has been updated and used up until the present day for over 400 years. Famously, this ship features one of the particular design quirks one would find when comparing a human vessel to that of a Tavarin. For you see, the humans at the time lacked any sort of air shields or shield technology, which the Tavarin possessed. Humanity had instead opted to build vessels with far stronger armor than that of any other species' vessels to compensate for this lack of shields. This particular design quirk, even upon the implementation of human shields, would later come in handy down the line for humanity, but this is beyond the scope of this story. Although achieving some major and minor victories, humanity had held the line for 2 years. High General Trevor Borland had grown quite bored of the complacency of high command. They had allowed the front to slowly settle and equalize, and as a consequence of this, the mobile war would go on from being a war of movement and sieges into a war of pure attrition. High General Borland wanted to, in proper fighting words, throw a punch to remind the Tavarin that they aren't the only ones with a martial culture. To show that even though humanity may have appeared to be on the back foot, an attack could throw the Tavarin off balance so that humanity could gain the initiative which had eluded them. Borland having successfully convinced High Command and his advisors, they started outlining concepts of a plan that would eventually become Operation Nemesis. Almost 2 years after the start of the war, humanity would launch the aforementioned Operation Nemesis. The hammer of the UPE would land where it all began, at Idris 4. The military intelligence arm of the UPE had identified a potential location for a decisive strike, a shipyard that acted as the main repair hub for the Tavarin occupiers that were on the planet's surface. In preparation for the attack, the UPE had gathered a force consisting of both army and marine units to practice what would become the largest human planetary invasion to date. The army and marines were drilled relentlessly with new and untested tactics and techniques, to where high command, military intelligence, analysts, and likely Borland himself would probably go on to write the human book on planetary invasions. Alongside the preparations made by the armed forces, the Military Research and Development Department, with their own army of scientists and technicians, accelerated the development and production of the new R-27HE hull shredder torpedoes. These sorely needed torpedoes became battle-ready on September 17th, barely 2 weeks before the counterattack would commence. The human fleet, upon clearing the Ferren-Idris jump point, were ordered to ignore the blockading Tavarin fleet and make a break straight towards Idris 4. The Tavarin attempted to stop the human onslaught in vain, and they broke through swiftly, with the human fleet gathering in Idris 4's atmosphere, hoping to lure the Tavarin fleet within it. As the UPE's fleet began gathering above Idris 4, the 112th Infantry Battalion was being deployed to the planet's surface, being led by Colonel T.O. Koshi. Alongside his own battalion, they were joined by A, B, and C mechanized companies on loan from the 3rd Expeditionary Unit. Together, they successfully stormed the shipyard, nicknamed the Hill, with resounding success, and victory appeared assured. But just as humanity had been preparing themselves, the Tavarin had not themselves been idle. The previously raided planetary defense system was top-of-the-line, experimental Tavarin technology that annihilated 2 human carriers within moments. The battle was joined with the Tavarin Navy, and the UPE Navy was put on the defensive and retreated from orbit to avoid further losses. Meanwhile, on the ground, as burning wreckage was falling all around them, the Tavarin garrison of the Hill returned with reinvigorated spirits and counterattacked. Being unfamiliar with Tavarin architecture, the ground forces struggled to properly secure the location and were suffering heavy losses, especially in regards to their vehicles, which were already down nearly 50%. In spite of their previous retreat, the UPE naval forces had still not entirely yielded the aerospace above the Hill just yet, knowing that if they pulled back any further, they would consign the soldiers below to certain doom and atrocities at the hands of the relentless Tavarin attacks. Over the course of the next day, the battle hung in the balance as the ground forces were grinded down by the stubborn Tavarin attacks. An extraction plan was being formulated by Major Michael Collery when his life was cut short by an unseen sniper. In his place would rise a name that would grow famous and infamous for centuries. As his commanding officer perished before him, Captain Ivar Messer, a young, dynamic, and ambitious officer, rose to the task and took command over what remained of the 3rd and the 112th. Instead of submitting himself to a costly withdrawal, Ivar called in danger-close airstrikes upon his positions to sweep the enemy off the field. He also organized ambushes against the constant Tavarin attacks to slowly and grindingly retake the initiative from the Tavarin. Captain Messer also saw fit to organize an infiltration team that would commandeer a Tavarin skiffer and break through the enemy lines and destroy whatever they could of the planetary defense system to aid the beleaguered fleet above. Not only did the infiltration team led by Sergeant Adam Core make it to the planetary defense system, they also managed to discover the Nexus, meaning that not only had they seized control of the system, they also had the ability to turn these weapons against the Tavarin themselves. As the Tavarin ships fell from the sky like burning feathers, it allowed for human reinforcements to arrive within the system and stabilize the lines. As the Tavarin was slowly pushed back by the reinvigorated human forces, Sergeant Core was forced to destroy and abandon the planetary defense nexus before the Tavarin could attempt to retake it. Hundreds of capital ships, thousands upon thousands of fighters, and 70,000 lives were extinguished on both sides. Captain Ivar Messer, the 3rd and the 112th, still maintained control over the Hill. With this stunning victory snatched from the jaws of defeat secured, the UPE's population was galvanized into mounting further resistance against the Tavarin, now being properly shown that these alien invaders could be defeated, and thoroughly so. On a tangent, a certain 42nd Squadron would be formed during the First Tavarin War, becoming a penal squadron, where they sent unruly and unreliable pilots that were simply too great of an investment to simply discard. They served throughout the war on the edges of great battles and earned no great renown. Capturing this spirit of victory was none other than a journalist by the name of Renzo Ui, who had been embedded with the 71st Carrier Wing, where he for 2 years relayed the stories of the men and women serving the UPE on the front lines. And whilst accompanying the 391st Squadron, Renzo would capture one of his most famous images, the so-called bombing run, which captured the 391st when they did what they did best, bombing Tavarin capital ships. These images, captured during Operation Nemesis, would be tied with humanity's spirit of victory that was on the rise upon the victory at Idris 4. But potentially the most consequential rise of all, however, was something that nobody really could ever have expected, that this battle would cause the rise of one of the most influential humans throughout history, Ivar Messa, who would go on to found an imperial dynasty that would last centuries. But that is beyond the scope of this story. After a currently unknown battle, or perhaps due to the losses incurred at Idris 4, and as a consequence of 2 more years of grueling attrition, the Tavarin would come to surrender to humanity, with symbolic action made by the now promoted Commander Ivar Messa, who brought the Tavarin warlord to the ground of the UPE Senate floor, both symbolically and in actuality ending the conflict. Upon the victory of mankind over the Tavarin in 2546 and the presumptive imprisonment of their leadership, the Tavarin, or what was left of them, was scattered, shattered, and confused as to what to do next. Some chose to remain in their home systems and accepted subjugation to the UPE, whereas others continued the fight in isolated pockets in a low-intensity conflict. But ultimately, a Great Depression fell over this once mighty people, one that they would not soon forget, nor soon would it pass. The caveat that caused great tension between the now subjugated Tavarin and the UPE was the banning of Tavarin habitation of their home world. Whilst it cannot be stated that the full war goals of the Tavarin were ever entirely known had humanity been defeated, but it is likely that humanity would have faced a similar fate. But to have considered the Tavarin's strength wholly spent would turn out to be a grave error. Ivar rode the wave of success he garnered for his exploits during the Tavarin War to become a High Admiral. His military prowess would also in turn out to be a talent for the political, as Ivar boldly strode onto the political scene with all the gusto a war hero could muster. Ivar proposed that the United Planets of Earth's tribunal, the head offices of the Union, was old-fashioned, while stoking fear that the technologically superior Xi'an lay upon the humanity's doorstep as a potential threat. Riding on a seemingly unstoppable political and military wave, he managed to reconstruct the UPE's government and consolidate the tribunal into one office, the Prime Citizen, which Ivar would soon be voted into the office of, becoming the first and last Prime Citizen. For the sake of brevity, it is important to know that Prime Citizen Ivar Messa further reorganized and reconstructed the government of the UPE into the UEE, or the United Empire of Earth, with Ivar as its first imperator, discarding the title of Prime Citizen entirely, and of course making the title of Imperator only inheritable by his descendants, turning the once semi-democratic UPE into the dictatorship of the UEE, marking a new era of humanity. In 2603, the first Imperator was now dead, replaced by his son and heir, Deacon Messa, noted down as Messa II, for some reason. Bearing the fruits of his father's labor, the UEE and the Xi'an Empire were now locked into a Cold War, which was a great political tool that Deacon effectively utilized to help cement his power and smoothen his ascension to the throne. But this pure focus on the Peri line that marked the border between the United Empire of Earth and the Xi'an Empire proved to be a grave error. For stirring in the unknown reaches of space, hidden for decades, Part of the Tavarin had been rebuilding their armies and their fleets for a struggle to retake what was rightfully theirs. Korath Thol, through unknown means, had risen to the position of warlord of the Tavarin remnant that was hiding out of the reach of the Messes. Like a lightning bolt on a clear day, the reconstructed Tavarin fleet emerged from an unknown jump point with the sole goal of reclaiming their homeworld and destroying what they could of humanity. Humanity's defenses being focused in an entirely different direction was initially in disarray following the sudden Tavarin re-emergence, with presumably much of the High Command growing complacent with the Cold War against the Xi'an. The highly mobile Tavarin battle fleet tore through humanity's defenses and scattered fleets with their newly upgraded Phalanx shield. As the UEE Navy struggled to meet the threat of the Tavarin, abandoned or less defended systems found themselves in need of some defense, causing the foundations of such militias as the famous Bremen Defense Force. The United Empire of Earth's navy and armed forces lacked the ability to mount a coordinated response to the Tavarin in the beginning due to intense interbranch rivalries that plagued command. Korath Thol was no fool, however, and refused to engage the UEE Navy where they were strongest, and resorted to a guerrilla campaign with focused hit-and-run attacks, further compounding humanity's initial inability to respond effectively. And in spite of the High Command's inability to deal with the crisis effectively, there was still a place for the common soldiers to outshine their superiors. During the Battle of the Korin Pass, a small force consisting of a mere 3 Nova tanks held off a persistent Tavarin attack for 16 hours before presumably being relieved or retreating. Tavarin forces managed to push into the Oberon system, where they in mid-2605 managed to capture a major landing zone on the planet called Uriel. Even though Uriel was a terraforming failure and left cold and quite barren, it sent shockwaves and a slight panic through the UEE, as the Tavarin had now not only managed to invade a planet, but also seize ground. UEE analysts feared that the Tavarin intention was to use Uriel as a staging ground for further attacks on the Vega and the Bremen system. Fears were also growing, and it was theorized that if the Tavarin reached the Peri line, there could be a potential Xi'an-Tavarin alliance, which could be an existential threat to all of humanity. To hamper their ability to strike, Marine General Russ Adachi proposed a more surgical strike into the Uriel system rather than one of brute force. The UEE Marines of the 1st Combat Battalion successfully attacked Uriel. The UEE Marines of the 1st Combat Battalion successfully attacked Uriel and managed to destroy a quantum fuel depot, but were unable to be lifted off the planet, and likely drawing inspiration from the Greys, decided to withdraw into the snow-filled mountains to continue a guerrilla campaign. The success of the 1st Marines would be widely celebrated, but the war would continue dragging on for 4.5 more grueling years, with humanity successfully keeping the feared Tavarin breach to the Peri line from occurring. Warlord Korath Thol and his Tavarin battle fleet would make an advance upon the Centauri system, where they would meet a reinvigorated 42nd Squadron. Having been recognized by Alexandra Dunleavy for the squadron's out-of-the-box thinking and confidence, she encouraged this culture to great success, and it would be sorely needed in the battle to come. The Tavarin struck into Centauri, with their main attacks landing upon the system's planets to force the UEE Navy to defend the civilian populations, not the jump point to Elysium, the Tavarin home system. As a hole was opening up within the human line, Captain Alexandra Dunleavy recognized what the true Tavarin intentions actually were. Captain Dunleavy successfully persuaded Admiral Fraser, presumably leading the defense of Centauri, of the value of her squadron, and had agreed to the strategy of withdrawing troops from the jump point to Elysium. And as the Navy slowly withdrew to sell a slow, grueling victory for the Tavarin, Korath Thol saw his goal in sight. Here, the size of the Tavarin battle fleet worked against them as the fleet attempted to move through the jump point. Korath Thol realized they could not move through it all at once, forcing the Tavarin to spread their line thin, which worked against them as more important and vulnerable targets became exposed to the UEE Navy. This is when Squadron 42 struck, having hidden with the debris as dead vessels. The 42's retaliators reactivated as the first Tavarin vessel attempted to make the jump. As the 42 started disabling the shields of enemy vessels, the rest of the Navy resumed their attack, pushing the Tavarin towards the jump point that could not accommodate them all. After 7 years of grueling warfare across many systems, the 42s managed to deal a stunning defeat against the Tavarin flotilla. As ship after ship was annihilated by the Navy, Korathol recognized defeat was at hand, scrambled together whatever ships he could, and quickly retreated into the jump point to escape into their once home system. Korathol and what remained of his once proud battle fleet arrived in the atmosphere of his species' home planet. Many of the Tavarin that had served beside him, and maybe even Korathol himself, had never laid eyes upon the cradle of their species. The surface, once their home, had been cleansed of Tavarin settlements and had been replaced with human colonies. As he gazed upon his home, Korathol would offer a final command to his fleet. "We die at home, and we die free." Disabling his ship's protective systems, the vessel he commanded nosed down towards the planet's surface, and he would soon be joined by his warriors, comrades, friends, and family as they streaked into the atmosphere. It is unknown how many vessels followed him down, but it was enough for the sky to look afire, with streaks of light looking like falling stars as they crashed towards the surface of Khif. This event would go on to be captured in the famous painting, The Tears of Fire, which would immortalize this final action by warlord Korathol. And with Korathol's final defeat and ritualistic death, the Second Tavarin War was all but over, with a few minor cleanup operations being required to hunt down the scattered remnant more thoroughly this time. With the defeat of Korathol and a significant portion of the Tavarin population, it could be surmised that the Tavarin species was left near extinction. What remained that didn't go into exile was reabsorbed into the UEE, where they hold status as civilians, with the number of citizens up to the present day only being counted in the tens or hundreds. After the war, the Tavarin became a lost people, a depressed people. Most came to despise and abandon their culture and faith, Rajora, as they believed that it had failed them. This event would go on to become known as the Purge, where parts of the Tavarin civilization that didn't disappear into the unknown parts of space turned their backs on Rajora. With the loss of their culture and language, many Tavarin turned mercenaries to channel their people's great sorrow into great violence. So in a way, their warrior way was still preserved. Some Tavarin also find themselves within the UEE military up until the present day. Most are, however, in penal battalions due to their previous criminal pasts, with most, however, still holding resentment towards the UEE military. Most Tavarin, however, decided to reserve themselves to a sort of apathy within the political structure of the UEE. With no clear leaders and no clear guiding star for the Tavarin, their culture entered a lull for the coming centuries. It wasn't until much later in the 30th century where a growing interest and resurgence for Rajora would find itself within the hearts of the Tavarin people once more, alongside the growing interest in their language and their culture. Grudges are of course still maintained and held amongst both human and Tavarin groups, with some healthy and some not so healthy xenophobic suspicions on both sides. But there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon where some wounds have seemingly begun to heal, where a deeper human Tavarin cooperation may flourish from. In 2946, Suj Koshi became the first ever Tavarin to be voted in as a senator from the Tavarin population, marking a great leap forward for the acceptance of the species within the human-dominated empire. There are of course cracks that are shown, like Tavarin voter suppression in 2950, but things are, however, faintly, slowly appearing to become more hopeful and prosperous once more, to perhaps a place where the Tavarin may regain some of their lost glory, perhaps not through war on humanity, but by reconquering their lost culture and gaining a larger influence and effect within the UEE as time goes on, with a potentially growing number of Tavarin citizens, meaning that they may one day grow from being a conquered people to an equal within a union in the empire. And perhaps one day, Elysium 4 will be called Khif once more. I hope you enjoyed this little experiment of mine, as I haven't really gone into the lore side of things this deeply. I decided I wanted to give this a go to see what this sort of content is like to produce, and if it perhaps will catch on. If not, I'll pretend this never happened and move on to my other regularly scheduled content. Please like, comment, subscribe, and all that other cringe shit. Please join the Discord. If you wish to support the channel monetarily, please do so by becoming a YouTube member or by going to my Ko-Fi and giving me some dosh. As always, a stupendous thank you to all my wonderful Bando merchantmen, without whom all of this would be improbable. A deep and most humble thank you to my wonderful Apex Fishies, Fond, Raptor Jesus, DJ Crowbar, Half-Breed Bastard, Magic. A suspicious thank you to my Sustremings, Nilsy Boy, Austrian Let's Play, DJ Crowbar, Combat Creations, Half-Breed Bastard, Leduc, Davidri. An ostentatious thank you to my fantastic people, Ifanura, Styles, Neoma, and Ignore Me. And a benevolent thank you to my Finthusiasts, Beskar Armor, Volteca, Dragon Fury, Tenkins, Elenium Productions, XDK, The Ham Jam, Noclat, Comrade Winston, Bloodix, and Monk. And a natural thank you to all my wonderful herrings and roes. Thank you all very much for the money. Oh, would you look at that, an end screen? How professional. Wow.